Next, we will try to understand about the PQRST in the ECG rhythm. Before understanding that, we have to learn two words, which is called depolarization and repolarization. It is an electrical activation of heart muscle cell which is caused by electrical process. When there is an electrical charge in the heart muscles, it will cause the contraction. So that process is called depolarization. The contraction is happening in the atrium and the ventricles. And the second term is repolarization. After the depolarization, a reverse electrical process occurs which makes the atrium and ventricle in the initial state, which is called repolarization. So let's speak about P wave in the ECG. P wave is a result of atrial depolarization. That means once the atrium is contracted in the right and the left, the P wave is generated in the ECG rhythm. Followed by the QRS wave. That is a result of ventricular depolarization. That means once the ventriculum is contracted, QRS is formed. Followed by T wave. That means once the ventricle is relaxed, the T generates. So now we will learn about the boxes in the ECG graph paper. We understood that PQRST is the result of cardiac conduction system, which helps to heartbeat. But how to understand the regularity, the speed and rhythm of the heart rate? So for that, we have to understand about the boxes in the ECG first. This small square represents 0.04 seconds. The large square is 0.2 seconds. 5 large squares is 1 second and 300 large squares is 1 minute. So to interpret the ECG into these boxes in the ECG graph paper, the ECG is divided into few parts. One is PR interval, then PR segment, then QRS complex, ST segment, T wave, RR interval and QT interval. So let's have an idea what is this intervals and segments. Starting with PR interval. The PR interval begins at the start of the P wave and ends at the beginning of the Q wave. It represents the time for electrical activity to move between the atria and the ventricles. The normal time taken for PR interval is 0.1 to 0.20 seconds. This normal timing should be memorized as we have to identify arrhythmias. The next one is the QRS complex. The QRS complex represents the depolarization of the ventricles. The normal time taken for QRS complex is less to 0.12 seconds. Then starting with ST segment. ST segment starts at the end of the S wave and ends at the beginning of the T wave. It is representing the time between the depolarization and repolarization of the ventricle. Next is the T wave. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization. It appears as a small wave after the QRS complex. The next one is the RR interval. It begins at the peak of one R wave and ends at the peaks of the next R wave. It represents the time between the two QRS complexes. The next one is the QT interval. It begins at the start of the QRS complex and finishes at the end of the T wave. It represents the time taken for the ventricles to depolarize and then repolarize.